Hello and welcome to the first part of Chapter 2 in the video series The Birth of Genetics and the Study of Heredity. In the previous episode, we ended with a simple but important question, which was, what existed before genetics became a science? Before genes had names, before chromosomes or DNA, people already understood something powerful. They knew, for example, that children resemble their parents. They knew that good animals tended to produce good animals. And they also knew that bad traits, once they appeared, they could stubbornly stick around. Heredity was somehow obvious, yet mysterious. Farmers didn't really understand why traits could be passed on, but they understood that they could use this fact. And few people used it as boldly as Robert Bakewell, an 18th century English farmer who practiced what we might call genetics before genetics even existed. For most of the 19th century, genetics as a science didn't really exist. There were no genes, no alleles, no Mendel's laws, and yet breeders relied on inheritance every day. By choosing which plants to cross and which animals to mate, they improved yield, size, strength, temperament, often with remarkable success. And this was not theory, this was practice. Heredity in this period occupied a strange space. Everyone depended on it, but nobody could explain it. And this is where Robert Bakewell becomes interesting. Bakewell can be described as a hero of the agricultural revolution in England. That revolution, the shift from open field subsistence farming to enclosed market-oriented agriculture, was already underway when Bakewell was active. So the real question isn't really whether he improved animals, it's how he did it. Was he simply a skilled breeder working within existing traditions, or did he actually change the logic of breeding itself? To answer that, we need to look first at his environment. Robert Bakewell did not emerge in a vacuum. He was born into a family of improving farmers. He learned the trade from his father and traveled across England, Ireland and Holland, observing regional agricultural systems. Bakewell also belonged to a network of Presbyterian dissenters, a tight-knit community outside the main church of England at the time. Many of his closer collaborators and pupils came from this circle, and they helped to spread his methods rapidly. But Bakewell's real advantage was his farm. Dishley Grange, Bakewell's family grange in Leicestershire, had already shifted from arable farming to grassland thanks to enclosure. An enclosure method, it allowed animals to be controlled, to be isolated, compared and deliberately bred. Bakewell ran the Dishley Grange as a living laboratory. By 1771, it held dozens of horses, hundreds of cattle and sheep, and multiple breeds at once, which some were brought even from the Cape and from Iceland. Visitors were invited to inspect the stock. Exceptional animals were preserved almost like exhibits. As a result, Dishley wasn't just a farm. It was a public experiment. Across sheep, horses and cattle, Bakewell followed one guiding principle. As his pupil George Cayley later recalled, Bakewell saw animals that would fatten the sooner, not much regarding horns, hides and legs, but chiefly backs, hips, ribs and shoulders. In modern terms, he selected for early maturity, for rapid fattening, and for high carcass yield. There were no measurements, no feed conversion ratios, and no genetic theory at all. Bakewell selected almost entirely on external form, by how the animal looked like. Later, historians criticized Bakewell's breeding method, but somehow it worked. This was heredity being manipulated in real time, even though nobody at that time knew what genes were. Bakewell's most controversial practice was one that he publicly defended, the persistent inbreeding. He called it in and inbreeding. Relatives were bred to relatives, generation after generation, in order to fix desired traits quickly. This was not entirely new. Foxhound breeders, such as Sir Thomas Meynell, had already used close breeding to stabilize hunting traits. But Bakewell went farther. He applied inbreeding systematically across livestock species and argued that the problem was not inbreeding itself, but losing control of it. Inbreeding amplified both strengths but also weaknesses, and Bakewell accepted that risk. What he gained was speed and predictability, far beyond what random crossings would achieve. But Robert Bakewell didn't just change breeding practices, he changed the breeding economy. Instead of selling rams, the male of the sheep, and bulls outright, he leased them. This was already common for horses, but was radical for sheep and cattle. These escalated dramatically. Rams that once cost a few shillings were later let for 80, 100, even 300 guineas, sums affordable only to wealthy landowners. Bakewell justified these prices strategically. Only the best animals would be used, and failures couldn't be blamed on inferior stock. Ironically, despite his prices, Bakewell's finances were often precarious. He spent heavily and ran costly tours, employed many laborers. His success was real, but fragile. While the most acknowledged success was in sheep, Bakewell also worked with cattle and horses. Bakewell's Longhorn cattle became famous, but its origin is disputed. Some historians trace them to the Canley herd in Warwickshire, owned by John Webster. Others emphasize Bakewell's own Dishley cattle, a local yellow breed already well known for its good fattening ability. In practice, Bakewell likely drew from multiple sources: Canley stock, Dishley cattle, and Longhorns from Lancashire and Westmoreland. Drawing from multiple sources is a way to expand genetic variability of its pool. But what mattered for Bakewell was not purity of origin, but consistency of selection. Bakewell selected cattle just as he selected sheep: rapid fattening, lighter bones, and thinner hides. By 1771, his cattle was described as famous throughout the kingdom. Yet, unlike his sheep, the Longhorns never truly spread. Exports were limited, and by the 1780s, Bakewell had already been surpassed by other breeders. In the long way, the Longhorn gave way to the Shorthorn, a breed that was better balanced between meat and milk production. So Bakewell's influence on cattle breeding was significant, but mostly national. On the other hand, his influence on sheep breeding was global. Bakewell's most enduring impact came from his work on sheep, reached slaughter about 1 year earlier than traditional breeds. In this way, production costs fell dramatically. In his breed, there was more meat and less bone, exactly what an urbanizing population was demanding. But there were trade-offs. The sheep were fragile, overfed, low in wool yield. Some observers described them as little waddling toads. But Bakewell didn't really apologize. He famously stated that he bred mutton not for gentlemen, but for the public. This made, again, economic sense. Meat demand was rising and wool demand was declining, and new feed crops allowed breeders to manipulate animal breeding more independently. The new Leicester breed of sheep did not survive intact as a modern breed, but its influence did. The Border Leicester breed of sheep directly descends from it, so that Bakewell's sheep reshaped breeding as far away as Australia. So, to sum up, Robert Bakewell never knew what a gene was. He had no statistics, no hereditary theory, no biology in modern sense. And yet, he demonstrated something crucial, namely that inheritance could be controlled, that breeding could be goal-oriented, and that animals could be systematically reshaped for economic performance. Bakewell did not invent genetics, but long before science caught up, he showed that heredity could be engineered. That's why he belongs in the story of the birth of genetics, even before genetics had a name. So, we have come to the end of this first part of the second chapter, the birth of genetics and the study of heredity. If you enjoyed these first explorations in the world of genetics before genetics, make sure that you subscribe so that you won't miss the next part of this chapter, where we will leave pastures and step more into the field, into the world of crop improvement before Mendel, where careful selection was already transforming agriculture and quietly preparing the ground for modern genetics. So thank you for watching, and like, comment, anything, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.